Yeah, thank you so much for joining, and hope the session brings answers to your questions. Right, so I think it's 11 a.m. Shall we make a start, Matthew?
Sounds good.
All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for attending today's session. So my name is Marlène, and I'm the Corporate Partnership Executive at ACEVO. So this morning I am joined by Matthew Hardwick from Zurich, who is a risk consultant. And today's topic will be on organizational resilience. Now, just before we get started, just to explain how Zoom will be working for us today. So as you already figured, we'll be using the chat box for question and answers. So I'll be reviewing your questions, and throughout the session, be sharing those questions with Matthew. If you also have questions around the slides, not to worry, we'll be sending those after the event, so you'll be able to review them, as well as this session, which currently is being recorded. So I think that's it for me, and now over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Marlène, and good morning all. As Marlène's just mentioned, I'm Matthew Hardwick. I'm a risk consultant for Zurich. Our team are a relatively small team, just sort of give you a bit of a background if you like. So we're a relatively small team. We specialise in working with senior managers of organisations or exec level trustees within organisations such as yourselves. And our primary aim is to support organisations such as yours, and fundamentally a large amount of them being customers of Zurich, supporting our customers to understand those strategic risks that are going to have a potential impact on your long-term objectives, your long-term goals. We're very much into sort of proactive risk management, if you like, rather than the reactive stuff. And hopefully today's session around organisational resilience will try and encompass a number of areas that we will touch upon. Just a little bit of background on myself. So prior to working for Zurich, I've been here about 3.5, 4 years now. But prior to that, I worked in the public sector for just over 10 years. And then within Zurich itself, I play an active role in supporting our third sector leadership team. So hopefully I'm suitably sort of aware of sort of some of the difficulties that your organisations do face. And hopefully, as I say, this session will give us a really good understanding as to what we're meaning by organisational resilience. So in terms of the key areas that I'm hoping to perhaps look on today, they're obviously listed on the screen. What we're trying to recognise is organisational resilience can be seen as quite an umbrella term, and there's multiple strands that will fall off it. And part of those strands we're going to cover today, things like financial resilience, governance, reputational risk, and risk culture, all fall under that banner, if you like, and having an opportunity to review each of them individually, but recognising their collaboration and how they collectively support the goal of the organisation is the main aim of the session. We're also going to look and reflect on what lessons we've seen from the pandemic so far. If any of you saw the news yesterday, it looks like it's going from bad to worse potentially in some areas. And also discuss how the world has changed, and actually how prepared are we as organisations to face the new risks that are out there, but also those new opportunities that do come. As Marlène has mentioned, if you do have any questions at any point, please throw them into the chat function. We'll probably have a break midway through this to sort of reflect and pick up some of those questions, and then certainly there's an opportunity at the end to answer those. So, as a starting point, what do we mean by resilience? And I think the statement on the screen, on the slide at the moment, is a really good place to start, if you like. And for me, there's a couple of key elements that I do want to sort of focus on. So the first line, or the first sort of comma point, the ability of an organisation to anticipate. I mentioned at the start, one of our roles that I undertake when I'm working with organisations in my sort of day job, if you like, is trying to instill that opportunity to focus on the future and try and anticipate future risks. If we were to look at what we thought 2020 was going to look like back in 2019, I'm pretty sure none of us would imagine that we'd be looking at a webinar screen today, all probably from our homes, rather than sat in a room hosted by ACEVO. We're obviously all operating and working in a very different environment. We need to take those lessons that we have learned so far and consider how they're having a new impact on our organisation. And then the final bit is around that survive and prosper. I think fundamentally all of us and all of our organisations, we're all existing and we're trying to deliver against what our key objectives are. And hopefully this session is going to feed in some key questions that you'll be able to take away from you and try and build upon that future resiliency. So how do we try and survive and prosper? How do we look to improve our resilience? Fundamentally, we're aiming to enhance that resilience within the organisation. As it says on the screen, that is an outcome of good practice and good business management. And that essentially is around managing risks effectively. If you think of your own organisations and how risk is viewed within the organisation, is it proactive and is it supporting organisational decision making? Or is it retrospective? Very often within organisations, we see risk management being brought in after an event has occurred, rather than trying to consider what those future impacts are likely to be and start looking at scenarios and how that's going to work. And hopefully, as I say, today's session will start to build around some of those elements, start to look at the key principles and start to hopefully instill that good practice, recognise where good practice is taking place, and ensure that risk and management of risk is fundamentally underpinning what's happening within the organisations. So what I've got on the screen at the moment is some key principles that underpin what we regard as being strong, resilient organisations. A foundation, if you like, around a strategy that the organisation can build upon. And I don't intend on going through each and individual sort of elements of these sort of the options that are on the screen, these pillars, if you like, but just picking out a couple of them. Understanding your organisation's context, and that comes from right at the very top and flows through down to every member of the organisation. Our staff, and whether they are employed staff, whether they are volunteering staff, are they all aware of what the organisation's primary objectives are? Do we know what we're here to deliver? If we do, then we're able to ensure that the organisation is moving in the right way. The last thing we want is some conflict that happens at any level that could potentially pull apart. If we're working collectively and collaboratively, we're going to be in a much stronger position. Good governance. What we're meaning here is around governance structures. Are they in place? But actually, once they're in place, are they supportive of the organisation? Are they proactive in what they're doing? Or are they just ticking a box because it says we've got to have a governance structure in place? And we're going to look at governance in a little while within this session. But we want to ensure that that's effective, that governance and those management arrangements. And then the last one I'm going to just touch on at this point in time is around effective risk management that's on there. And I suppose as a risk consultant, you would expect me to focus on risk management. It's my bread and butter. It's not what everyone finds exciting, but for my sins, actually, no, I wouldn't lie. I don't find it overly exciting myself, but it's certainly a key element that we focus on a daily basis. And again, what we're meaning here is, do we have risk policies in place? Are risk registers reviewed? Are they proactively reviewed and are they challenged, rather than them being a tick in the box exercise that we get to once a quarter? We've got to look at our risks. We want to ensure that risk management is proactive in supporting those decision makings. I've mentioned it earlier on, and I'll probably continue to mention it as I go through this session, because it really does underpin what we're meaning by it. The last thing we want is static risk registers, and I'm sure all of you listening at the moment will be able to perhaps think of your own organisations, your own risk registers. Do the risks change over time? Do they evolve? Do they morph into new things and new risks as they come about? Or do you, when you look and review your risk registers, do you all collectively look at them and say, oh, yeah, that still sounds about the same, we'll leave it as it is? What we're trying to strive towards upon is ensuring that risk management is an opportunity to make sure we've got the right root cause in, and then we can start to appropriately manage those accordingly. But I think these for me are the sort of key pillars around what we build upon. And what I'd like to now do is sort of dive into some of the more key elements of what makes up resilience. And there's a whole raft of these things, and many of them are interconnected, and they work alongside those key pillars. And like I say, within this session, we're going to focus on a few of these around financials, reputation. We'll look at governance. Going to touch on sort of partnerships, supply chains, understanding whether you are upstream or downstream on your supply chain. It may be that you're a supplier rather than necessarily contracting services out. And we'll look at sort of risk culture as well. But there's recognizing that there's a whole raft of different elements that make up what makes up a strong, resilient organization. You need to have a handle on all of them and understanding how they each influence each other. As I say, I'm sure within your own organizations, you can possibly look at some of those sort of key elements that are identified on the screen and think of your own organizations and perhaps think where you've got particular strengths, but maybe particular areas where you can look to develop them in the future. So why do we need to address resilience? And I think for me, what's particularly key here is recognizing that the world we're in at the moment is changing and it is evolving. Even prior to the pandemic at the start of this year, probably a large elements that are shown on the screen were extremely relevant. If we look at technological areas, automation, artificial intelligence is an area that is growing at an exponential rate. Linked to that is things like the Internet of Things, this interconnectivity of devices. Some of your organizations may already have started looking at ways in which automation and artificial intelligence can support your organization and look to enhance the delivery model that you've got. We're certainly seeing it. Customers of Zurich's are already starting to explore elements of this area and certainly other areas within the third sector market. We're seeing lots of customers, lots of organizations who are starting to consider this, starting to embrace this. And it may be from fairly simple elements like a chatbot type exercise whereby customers of yours can interact with the organization, but they're doing so through typing a question into a search engine, to a sort of chatbot facility that a machine is actually responding to rather than a person at the end of it. But those elements there's lots of opportunities there, but with those opportunities comes new risks and comes new challenges. Looking at some of the other areas that I've picked up on the screen, the sort of political environment is continuing to evolve. Brexit has been on the table for a good number of years now. It's likely that sort of as we head into 2021 and we know what sort of deal we're going to get from the Brexit negotiations, that's going to potentially throw out new risks, new challenges for us. And from an organisational point of view, how do we ensure that we can anticipate what's likely to happen and those impacts that could have on our organisation, to ensure that we've got a suitable process built in and started to scenario plan to ensure that we as an organisation do look to survive and prosper as we move into the new world and how that new political arrangement, that new Brexit arrangement looks. I think one of the big things that for me I've seen certainly in perhaps more recent terms as we've moved through the pandemic is changing behaviours, and this has probably started quite some time ago, and then the pandemic has acted as a bit of a catalyst and speeded up some of these changes. But our customer base is shifting and is evolving to a certain extent, and customers' donations, people who are making those donations, they are wanting to understand more and more in depth as to what's happening with those donations. But also people's attitudes are shifting. The global environment is certainly an area that is a very high topic area at the moment, and people are very keen to understand green credentials. As an organisation, needing to recognise what is sort of hot topics, if you like, across the customer base, and how do you tap into those markets, how do you use them. We're seeing, linked to technology, but we're seeing an increase in demand for individuals wanting that rapid transaction. They're wanting fast information, they're wanting to understand it. So how do we ensure that as an organisation we embrace that and we support it, but ultimately it's there to support our own objectives and it's there to support what we're doing. And finally, the sort of final box on the screen, looking at difference in our system complexity and how they are changing. I've seen, again, as a result of the pandemic, organisations are starting to supply and contract out different elements of their work in areas where perhaps they'd never even considered before. I was working with one organisation recently who have contracted out a particular specialism to an individual who's suitably qualified but is based in Greece. But because everything is now being done remotely and people are doing it over webinars, Zoom calls, things like that, actually it's quite possible and feasible to be able to tap into a resource that's from overseas, when actually historically they've perhaps only been sort of being dictated by their narrow boundaries and local boundaries that they perhaps operate within. The changing circumstances, the change in what we're looking at is allowing organisations to explore those opportunities, which is on one hand very, very good and very positive and something that we look to encourage. But similarly, it's recognising those potential risks that come on board and that sit within it, and fundamentally, are they supporting the objectives of the organisation? Are they supporting our resilience? And how do we ensure that we build in the right level of resilience into our business to ensure that we are able to survive as we move forward? But as I say, so those are our sort of key pillars, if you like, and sort of key areas that we're recognising exist and we're going to look to focus on. What I'm going to try and do now is go through different elements that I picked up earlier on that sort of spider diagram. I'm going to pick up on a few of them and go through them in a bit of detail. Please continue to sort of fire in questions and we'll have a short break in a minute or two to sort of pick up some of those questions that might have already come in. If I'm going to start off with risk culture, this is very often the sort of tone from the top, if you like, and as the sort of the definition from the IRM, the Institute of Risk Management, outlines there in the box on the left-hand side. We're looking at the values, the beliefs, knowledge and understanding that are shared by a group of people for a common purpose. If we think of all our staff base, are our staff working towards that shared understanding, shared beliefs and group knowledge? And the common purpose being the delivery of the organisation's objectives. One of the reasons why we particularly like the IRM model, for me, it's a nice simplistic model. This ABC model that's shown on the right hand side. So you have the attitudes, and that's attitudes of staff, it's attitudes of trustees, it's attitude of customers, and how that shapes the behaviour of those within the organisation, and that indeed forms the culture, which then influences back into the ABC model. So you get a lovely cyclical model that drives the culture within the organisation. And again, I won't ask you to name names, but think of your own organisation. As a member of staff within that organisation, do you have a very clear knowledge as to what the common goal is that is being strived for? And if you do, that's great. Is that then shared and disseminated across the wider staffing base that you have within your organisation? And if it's not, what can we possibly do to improve that? For me, there's some sort of key themes, key aspects, if you like, that we would look to try and adhere to. And I've tried to break it down into these 4 key areas. If we start with the tone from the top, think of it as a pyramid type structure. So the tone at the top, have we got that clarity of direction? Is it articulated within policies? Do we have clear business plans? It may be that those business plans have had to change quite significantly in the last few months, as lots of organisations have had to rapidly shift and change as we've moved through the different stages of the pandemic. But are these very well embedded? Are our leaders clearly visible? The responding to bad news, do we welcome disclosure from senior management? Or is there a nervousness around how we're going to respond to this in the event that this bad news story, whatever it might be, that if that breaks? The next element is around governance and links obviously into what we're going to cover very shortly in this presentation. But do we have a governance structure? Is it clear who is accountable for the different elements within the organisation? Do we have risks and risk management responsibilities built into officers' roles and responsibilities within job descriptions and what's expected of them? That transparency of risk information, is everybody aware of the sort of key risks, key strategic risks that are impacting on a potential organisation? That helps to form the rest of the pyramid down into much more operational level risks. They could be health and safety level risks, they could be different elements that are impacting on a small team within the organisation. But fundamentally, they all feed up into the higher part of the pyramid and feed up into those key strategic risks. Those of us who are involved in risk management, are we empowered to do what we should be doing and what we've got on our plates to do? Do we have the right skill set to be able to deliver those? Is there a key senior officer who has some responsibility and that links us back into governance? Do we have that accountability flow? Do we know who's the responsible officer? And then finally, and I've mentioned this already, and as I say, we'll continue to do so, but decision making, risks being a fundamental part to an organisation's decision making, looking at both sides, the pros and the cons. Being able to do that will allow us to be a much more resilient organisation because we're already starting to consider the potential scenarios around this. We're looking at what the positives are and we're looking at what the negatives could be. Where we see organisations that are doing each of those elements, and certainly most of them in a very strong way, is where we see our most resilient organisations. The ones that are struggling with various elements, that's where we perhaps have a nervousness and a worry with those organisations in the event of some incident happening which occurs, and it can create disruption. So what does good look like within those? And you're probably already starting to form your own opinions, and you'll be able to perhaps think of your own organisations and think, oh crumbs, yeah, actually we might not have X or Y. But for me, fundamentally, we want to ensure that our senior managers are visible, and in particularly visible around how risks are managed. The last thing we want is risk management being paid lip service.
Excuse me, Matthew. There seems to be a little issue with the sound from your end. Sorry. Can't hear you still, sorry. Not really sure what happened. Your mic is showing as on, so perhaps from your computer, some function that has been changed. But from what I can see your mic fine. Oh, perfect, yeah.
Yeah, does that work?
That works.
Okay, well,
yeah.
I don't know what happened there, as I did nothing and changed nothing, but it's obviously come back. No apologies.
No problem. Governance. I think you stopped at governance.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we sort of look at what good should look like, and already you're probably forming your own opinions around those sort of key elements. As I say, from my point of view, in terms of what good should look like, we want to ensure that senior managers are visible around managing risks. We want to ensure that they are taking that proactive view. The last thing that we want to see, from my point of view, when we sort of review organisations and work with organisations, the last thing we want to see is that risk registers are played are given the sort of final slot on an agenda item, given a bit of lip service. Oh, can we all review this? Can we sort of feedback any updates? Actually, a really good risk organisation and a really mature organisation will be reviewing risk because they're the elements of the business that you're perhaps most concerned with at the moment. And actually, your risk register almost becomes your agenda for meeting elements and areas. mentioned governance earlier around how risks and the accountability for risks are captured within job descriptions, potentially linked to performance targets, and ensure that that is given an accountability and given it the priority that it needs to ensure that it is reviewed. Under competency, I've put structure risk champions. Actually, that may not be appropriate for the size of your organisation, but actually ensuring that you've got other colleagues that you can lean upon and challenge your own view and your own information is absolutely the starting point. And risk always starts as one person's view, and then it's around challenging your view and challenging that view with others, and looking to get that collective view. And finally, in terms of decision making, that willingness to embrace risk, and people, you might have heard the phrase risk appetite, is what we're trying to look at here, and actually understanding that the organisation will have an appetite to around the levels of risk that we want to undertake. But then also we want to ensure that within the organisation we'll have different officers that will have different appetite levels of risk, and we need to share that ideas, we need to share that understanding and come to a collective agreement rather than it just being potentially one area. This is where I often criticise finance people, because finance people tend to be very, very risk averse. They like cash in the bank rather than potential investment opportunities. But we need to understand those nervousness as we look to take those opportunities that may well be there and available. I have seen a question around risk leadership, and I'll come back to risk leadership, because the point is absolutely right, Judith, around the last thing we want to be is risk averse. We need to embrace changes, and it needs to be around taking risks. And I'll hopefully come back to it very shortly, and if I don't, Marlene, I'm sure we'll make sure I do come back to it. So moving on from culture, and linked to culture is risk governance. And what we've got here is a 3 lines of defence model. And some of you might have seen this, some of you might have heard of it. And what we're trying to encourage is that we embrace each element of those lines of defence. So internally within an organisation, and it may well be that some of your lines within your organisations, again, depending on the size of the organisation, some of your lines might be blurred across these. But when we talk about first lines, we're talking about the controls measured. So this is where policies, procedures, are they in place? Are they understood? Are they being followed? That's our first line. Having them is the first point of call. The second line of defence is when we're starting to consider, do we have individuals that are responsible for overseeing risk management? That might be a director, it might be finance, it may be an incorporation of both or an amalgamation of both within your organisation. And then it may well be that you have compliance areas, again, that are involved in overseeing it and fundamentally, if you like, policing to see that the policy is doing the right thing and staff are following the policy, and then it's those individuals that ensure that. And then the third line of defence, and one that's very often sort of overlooked, if you like, is the benefit of internal audit. And it may well be that your audit department is something that you outsource or that you get in from a third party. But embracing those as risk managers, they are a brilliant resource in ensuring that we are, as an organisation, we're identifying and reviewing the correct elements. And it also helps us to police and ensure that that good practice is taken on board. The last thing we want to see within risk registers, as an example, if you have timescales that just say, oh, these actions are ongoing, rather than specific timescales around this is going to be done by December 2020. If it's ongoing, it's very, very difficult for us to review it and say, well, what we're doing here, how much progress are we making, and indeed challenge it in the event of that timescale is potentially passed, and why has it passed, and what's been the impact of it. And then outside of your organisation, outside those 3 lines of defence, you may have access to external audit. You may have, you may work with organisations such as ourselves, an external risk party, risk consultancy that can review, look at the regulator and the information that they can provide. Organisations such as ACEVO and your membership into that organisation and the support that they can provide. all help to improve and embed a good governance structure within your organisation. So that's culture and governance done, and if you've not already sort of got a flavour, we're going to sort of try and touch on a number of elements relatively quickly, and I recognise that it's difficult to go into the full detail of these elements, but hopefully it gives that oversight as to some of those key areas that we do see that crop up when it comes to organisational resilience. Supply chain, and in particular business continuity. I suppose the first point to consider within as a supply chain is whether you are upstream or downstream. And by that, what I mean is if you're upstream, are you contracting services out, and therefore you have third-party providers delivering services on your behalf? Or if you're downstream, are you a supplier to somebody else? And it may well be that you're both. The graph on the screen tries to demonstrate what happens in the event of a particular instance. So our productivity level is relatively high, and it's occurring at a straight line at that #1 level. Then we have an hour event that occurs, and it causes some sort of disruption. The pandemic is a great example here. You know, back in March, we were all put into lockdown. Day-to-day lives were significantly altered, significantly shifted. Our working patterns changed, shops, etc., closed, and our ability to go out to them significantly diminished. So we put into some emergency practices, which is our #2. #3 is then how we start to recover as an organisation, and we start to salvage what we've got, and we start to move into that business recovery element, which is #4. That is a graph that demonstrates an organisation that perhaps has a fairly weak business continuity plan. Those that are very strong, and lots of organisations have probably brought in and reviewed your business continuity plans as a result of the pandemic. And what would be interesting if we were all sat in a room and had perhaps more time to look at this in more detail, because we could probably talk I could probably talk for hours on business continuity. But how successful have those plans been at recovering yourself? That increased resilience line, that dotted red line, demonstrates that strong organisations that do consider this very well are able to recover quicker and able to recover close to a historic previous normal level, as opposed to organisations that perhaps haven't considered these elements in full. This particular slide, I fully intend to just quite quickly gloss over, if you like. It when you get the slide pack, it's more of an opportunity to consider, are we looking at these things, and are we considering them? And certainly the pictorial point on the screen largely won't apply to yourselves. I'm almost certain that probably your organisations don't involve logistics that require airport transition and things like that. But it's a good demonstration of how as a customer you are influenced by lots of different areas. And when you're looking either as a supplier to an organisation, or indeed trying to work with another supplier on your behalf, ensuring some of these elements, fundamentally what we're trying to get to is that the cheapest isn't always the best, and so we need to consider how that organisation looks, where does it work, where do we work potentially if we're supplying into an organisation, and how do the business objectives align with each other. But as I say, it's some key points to consider, and I won't necessarily go through them in full detail at the moment. Again, what I have included here is around sort of a self-assessment. So there's 10 questions here. They're simple yes/no questions. And even if we were all in a room and I could see the whites of everybody's eyes, I wouldn't put anybody on the spot to say, how does this look? But what I will give is a sort of an indication, if you like. So when you're looking at this, perhaps outside of this session, if you're able to answer those 10 questions and you're saying 8, 9, 10 of them you're responding yes to, then actually there's probably a very good chance that you've got a very good understanding of the risk that you're facing. But conversely, if you're unable to answer yes to very many of them, it perhaps demonstrates there's an opportunity here to quite significantly review our supply chain and what we are developing and what we're understanding by that. Moving on to the next element around financial resilience, and I think this is probably one of the biggest areas post-lockdown, and certainly one of the biggest demands on organisations as you've gone through the lockdown process and the pandemic continues to impact. It's very likely that your budgets have been significantly impacted, and certainly, budget plans that were written 2019 for 2020 and beyond. As a minimum, they've probably had to change. It's very likely that they've had to be thrown out the window and started all over again. And what drives that is that financial solvency for the organisation. And there's many facets that feed into it, and I've tried to incorporate them on the screen and recognise some of those key elements around donation behaviours. Lots of customers that we've had within Zurich, and you guys may be one yourselves, we've seen a shift in donors, perhaps looking to support different organisations to perhaps what they might have historically supported. Certainly health sector organisations have seen in some areas significant increases in donors, as a lot of the publicity, certainly at the start of the lockdown, around sort of the demands on the NHS and other health sector services that were potentially impacted. We've seen lots of information, if you like, around sort of the increase in demand on certain sector areas. Funding events cancelled at the very top of the tree, things like the London Marathon. You might be an organisation that relies heavily on those sorts of events, and it may well be that that particular one and the marathon is particularly important to yourselves, or it may well be much smaller scale events, but they've been cancelled. We've lost those opportunities to incorporate our revenue. We might be delivering contracts for services to another party. The KPIs within those, we may have had payment thresholds that we are unable to meet because service delivery has been impacted. How do we have those conversations with those organisations who are reluctant to pay because we're not delivering, but we can't deliver because of the circumstances? Largely, contracts have been written well before a pandemic was considered. And so it's very difficult for us to then sort of have subsequent conversations around that. We've seen depletion of reserves. Somebody very early on, I was talking to an organisation who referred to it as their rainy day fund. And every organisation strives to have that rainy day fund. But I think what the pandemic has highlighted is actually that rainy day fund was perhaps designed to support an organisation for a relatively short space of time in the event of, for argument's sake, a loss of building due to a flood, for an example, and perhaps wasn't there to sustain an organisation through 6 months of prolonged disruption, and so those reserves have largely gone. And then it's around how, as an organisation, we work with what we've got at the moment. We look to try and build those reserves back up into a pot that we've got available to us. And one of the other areas that we've seen organisations face a significant loss of revenue is around the retail lockdown. Some of our organisations that we work with quite regularly, they might have shops on the high street that they trade out of, and that loss of revenue has obviously been very, very keenly felt. Understanding the threats to those will allow us to start trying to plan and start trying to consider what opportunities there are available to us. And just before I take a very quick questions break, some more bad news. If we look at the sort of short to medium term when it comes to financials, and I'm not going to go through all of these because I've already touched on things like reserve depletion on the left-hand side, but also how is home working and our perhaps head office buildings, how is that impacting on our future business strategy? Are we considering whether actually those head office buildings that we might have that cost significant sums of money to insure, to rent, to heat, to light, etc., are they still required, or actually are we potentially finding ourselves in a new way of working where not only staff but the deliveries are at least comparable to what they were previously? Can we start to look to incorporate this new way of working, and possibly staff might be enjoying it? But similarly with home working, we've got lots of staff who are now no longer sort of at their regular touch points. So we need to ensure that we work and ensure that staff are fit, healthy, working appropriately, not necessarily sat on the sofa watching TV whilst also trying to answer some emails, etc. Other areas, second wave, I wrote this particular slide deck a couple of weeks ago, and as I say, yesterday's announcement strongly suggests that the second wave, if it's not already here, is coming back. How are those future measures that have been rumoured in terms of sort of tighter restrictions, tighter lockdown measures, closing of particular sort of restaurant type areas later on in the evening? What impact is that going to potentially have on our staff base, our customers? How prepared are we, and how can we sort of ensure that we've got that resilience built into our organisation? I think looking at that third column, one of the biggest elements for me that I'll mention now is around, actually this is not just affecting a small area within the UK, or not just even just the UK, it's right across the globe, and recognising that global recession, and it is affecting everybody, but it is very, very difficult for us to sort of start trying to future plan. We're doing a session, I think next month it is, with ACEVO around horizon scanning and scenario analysis, and it's very much those elements we're trying to piece together in terms of what is the future going to look like, and it's something I would implore sort of all organisations to start considering around what does our future look like, what's our future objectives. I think, Marlene, I know there's a couple of questions coming in, but do you want to just sort of fire a few into me and take a short pause at that point before I move on?
Yes, absolutely. So that was Judith's question, which you saw earlier, about how to ensure we do risk leadership without being risk averse. Is it something you want to cover off now? Because getting through these times will require us to be bold and take some risks. So happy.
Yes, I think what we need to ensure here, I absolutely agree with Julie's point. It's very natural for organisations to be risk averse, and leadership in particular, the hesitancy sometimes is very obvious. I think the only way to do it is ensure that when we're considering our options and our opportunities, is that we are very clear, and we've gone through this horizon scan, this scenario analysis, and we've looked at both the positive and the negatives, and we've tried to document it and give that particular scenario enough thought and consideration, and that requires a number of individuals to be involved in it. It might be a workshop type scenario setting, and you start with the outlandish and start with the realistic, and start bringing those ideas together, and forming a good basis, rather than it being almost a bit ad hoc. We want to try and create some structure around it, so that whilst we are looking to take decisions and be proactive and take those opportunities, we're doing it from a sound basis where risk is sort of playing quite a fundamental and key part to it. So it's difficult, and there's no easy answer, but if risk can be embedded within that decision making, you'll probably find it a much easier opportunity to get those bold decisions taken and made.
Great, thank you for that, Matthew. Another question from Alice, asking if you have any template business continuity plans that you can share after this session.
Probably the short answer is disappointingly probably no, and the reason I say that, as a consultant service, we obviously trade our services, so we sell our time, we sell our expertise, and part of that is around developing a business continuity plan that's fit and appropriate for an individual organisation. Alice, it might be an opportunity perhaps to have a conversation with you after, and just to understand that I see your point around it. It's very thorough but not very accessible. It might be easier for perhaps me to have a conversation with you just to understand what you've got, and I can certainly give some key pointers rather than being able to perhaps give you a particular template that's very easy to follow and use.
All right, great, thank you, Matthew. I think so far these were the only question we'd see.
That's fine. That's fine. Brill. I'll move us on, because I'm very conscious of time, but and also trying to sort of skim through some of these other elements that thankfully aren't as in depth, if you like, around the sort of finances that we've already looked at. One of them is around reputation, and reputation risk is something that we perhaps need to have an awareness of when we're making and taking our actions, taking our decisions. And this perhaps links back in a way to Judith's point around making those bold decisions. Very often one of the things that might prevent it and might create some risk aversion is around what could this do to us? What are we going to look like in the press? What's going to look like in our customers' views, if you like? And there's some key quotes on there around sort of what reputation means and how quickly it can be eroded. One of the most famous ones is around Ratner's jewellery from back in the 90s, and some of you might possibly remember it, might be aware of it. But Ratner's jewellery was very successful, even though their business model, if you like, their market was particularly low-end quality and price jewellery. And their CEO at the time, Gerald Ratner, was making a speech back in '91 and made comments to the fact that their jewellery was particularly poor quality, and they were able to sell it because it was rubbish, and that's why it was cheap. Almost overnight, the business started to suffer significant losses. Within a year, they'd lost half a billion of their value. As an organisation, Gerald Ratner was fired from his position within the company at the end of '92, and by '93, the organisation had been completely rebranded. So in such a short space of time, one comment had totally impacted on the organisation's reputation. And there are countless examples out there, and you'll be able to think of your own organisation's reputation, but you'll also have in your own personal life examples of organisations that you think have particularly good reputation and those that perhaps aren't as strong a reputation, and that will probably impact on how you would deal with them. And so being aware of your reputation, very, very key. And I'll come back to sort of an element of how we can incorporate that as risk managers towards the end of this session. This is perhaps an opportunity for us to link back and linking reputation into business continuity. In the event of a significant disruption to our organisation, we need to understand and recognise that crisis communications have changed, and the rules around that have changed. And what I mean is, first and foremost, speed has significantly shifted, and people's demand for information quickly and instantly has led to such a rise in things like social media and how that provides information. I think one of the examples I used in a different session quite a long time ago now was a couple of years ago. There was particularly heavy snowfall where I live, and that naturally brought out all the chaos shopping, people panic buying sort of bread, milk, etc. And we were walking around our local supermarket, and my wife took a photo of the empty shelves and put it on her Twitter account. And just as a crumbs, look at this is madness type comment. Within 45 minutes, she'd been contacted by one of the broadsheet newspaper journalists to say, can I use your photo in an article that I'm writing that just goes to sort of demonstrate how people are panic buying across the country. It was within an hour. The picture was live on large newspapers headlines and was in their sort of online articles. But just goes to show how that is evolving, that is changing. Recognizing it, that the impact of your reputation that can have, it can only take one person's tweet as a result of their experience. And likewise, understanding that your responses as an organisation to those events need to be equally quick, but firm and clear, concise, etc. when it comes to comms. Being transparent, being honest, as I say, as well as we need the speed, we need to ensure that we are clear in our messaging that we're giving up. Very often, the ones that we all remember, it's the organisations that try and cover it up rather than actually what it was that generated the problem in the first place. So if we can ensure that we are clear, we are honest, and it links back to that culture piece that we had earlier on. What's that tone at the top? How do we respond to bad news, etc.? That sort of links us in quite nicely there. Understanding that every employee is a brand ambassador, so everybody that we have a touch point in. they have sort of carry the badge of our organisation, and if in doubt, one of the ones that we put on here is the Netflix social media's policy for employees. They encourage a freedom of and responsibility, but equally be sensible. Think about what it is that you might be posting on things like social media. Whatever you post, be it in a personal context, does have connotations. It links you into an organisation. So ensure that what you're putting isn't going to be potentially detrimental one way or the other. Understand that ambassador's role. And also think about what we call the Google effect. The old adage of, you know, today's news is tomorrow's fish and chip paper, again, isn't there anymore. Internet files exist for years and years. Links are always, they remain available, they remain live very often, and you can find bad news stories that can go back years and years. So be aware of it, because how you respond to those incidents at the time will also remain live, will also remain current, and will be linked back. So an opportunity again to feed in your reputational knowledge, your reputational damage considerations, but also think about how that plays into your business continuity. As risk managers, one of the questions very often is, okay, how do I start on this? I'm looking at my risk register, and how do I try and piece together all of these elements to ensure that when I'm presenting back to leaders, and Judith, this might help your risk averse question that we had earlier on, how do I present back the full information? And what I would encourage organisations to do, and good practice, is look at risks in these 4 orders. So if we take the first order being direct damage, what we're meaning about here is things that are really tangible and obvious. This could be a loss of premises, it could be an impact on an individual, and it's very clear to understand that we've lost that building, or that individual suffered an injury, and we've got to resurrect that, we've got to solve it, we've got to put the building right, we've got to pay compensation to that individual. The second order then is the consequences of it. So if we've lost our building, we might be unable to operate out of it, and that means we've got a loss of productivity. So not only have we got to put the building back right, we've then got to try and recover some of the time and some of the expense that we might have lost as a result of being unable to produce anything or deliver a service. If we're potentially working with a social care setting, for example, if we lost an individual that was unable to work, does that impact on caseloads? How do we recover that? How do we get it back? Moving into our third order, this is where we're starting to consider things like reputational damage. We might lose a market share as a result of what's happened previously, the loss of our building, our inability to deliver a service. Suddenly our market's going elsewhere. The demand for our service remains, but we're unable to meet it. So those customers move on and go to another organisation. That might damage our image. There might be an increase in management time to try and rectify it. Staff might start to move on and start to look for elsewhere in other employment. And that moves us into our fourth order, these consequences, which as risk managers is very often the easy bit, because we're great at sort of disaster scenarios and what does this mean? What could this happen? And this could be loss of staff, loss of business. There's a whole raft here, but that's a really good way of trying to piece together a good risk and clearly articulating what do we mean by this particular risk. Coming towards the end of the session now, and what I'd just like to sort of throw in, and we said at the very start, I said at the very start, that we're going to consider the sort of the impact of the pandemic and risks that are associated to that, and how this new world is starting to look and starting to evolve. Again, this was pieced together a couple of weeks ago now, and already some of these are starting to change and starting to shift. What we are seeing is particular concerns around a prolonged recession, and how does that link into our financial resiliency? What do we have to potentially slim down in order to ensure that as an organisation we do survive? And then long term, how do we get ourselves back to a position where we can start to prosper? Technological side of things, we're seeing an increase in cyber attacks because staff are potentially working from home, working on mobile devices. Things like VPN are having to be rolled out at quite a quick pace to ensure that staff are keeping themselves and keeping documentation safe. someone once said to me that it's what staff do in an office setting can sometimes be very different to what you would do in a home setting. You know, locking your machine when you're going to get a cup of tea in the morning or in the afternoon. You might have other people within the house. You need to, you know, consider them in exactly the same way as actually, have I got confidential information on my screen? But also having the same thought process when you get that email link that says click on this because you've won the Nigerian lottery that you've never entered. When you're in the work setting to when you're in the home setting, your attitude can sometimes shift and can be slightly different. So ensuring the organisation is continuing to reinforce those good practice measures. And then there's some other ones on the screen there. And what we're going to do, for those of you who might be joining the session next month, we have a session on horizon scanning. We're going to look at some of these top concerns and how they play out. So I'm conscious that we're up to sort of our last 5 minutes, and one of the key things that I do want to pick out, I'm going to gloss over this particular slide. When you get the pack, this is taken from a global report. It was produced in June, but what it starts to highlight is some of the top concerns that are and top risks, if you like, that are affecting global organisations. You'll be able to have a look at it when you see it, but there's things like continued recession, another wave of the pandemic, and then further down we've got sort of climate change impacts, etc. I think for me, one of the sort of key lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and what we can take forward is around ensuring that our strategic messaging continues to be clear, continues to be concise, is shared and shared with staff. Look at our long-term goals and how they're impacting on our finances, what opportunities are there available, and how risk management can underpin and support all of those processes that take place. This does give us an opportunity to build a better future. Any change gives us that opportunity, and hopefully the pandemic for your own organisations, whilst being incredibly disruptive, there are opportunities out there, and your resiliency will improve just by learning those lessons from the impacts that you have had. I'm going to just gloss over these last few slides just to get us to my final one, which is around quick wins. So this is areas of how we can improve our resiliency that actually we can probably do fairly quickly and fairly concisely. Look at your governance. Do we have a clear strategy that has clear targets, and are these achievable targets, particularly in light of what's happened in the last 6 months or so? Our risk management, consider what it is we're reviewing as risks. Are we looking at predominantly operational risks at a senior level, or are we focusing on the right strategic viewpoints? Link it back to our long-term objectives. Consider what the threats are to those objectives. Consider horizon scanning. Look at the scenarios. What could potentially happen, and how does that impact on us in the delivery? Elements of cyber. If you don't have a digital strategy, consider looking at how we start to implement one. Again, ownership. Who's the responsible individual within the organisation? How do we get engagement within staff and within all parts of the organisation to ensure that cyber continues to be treated in the right frame of mind? Keeping staff engaged and motivated. So what training is available? We need to encourage that agility. One of the most sort of key pillars, if you like, for organisational resilience is that agility and that ability to move and change as both as staff and individuals, but that will help our organisation because they feed that culture model that we had at the very start. And finally,